The fluorescent lights of the boardroom felt like heat lamps, but Elias Thorne was the one under the microscope, his career bleeding out over a 3 o'clock fever. It was not a missed deadline that brought him here, nor a catastrophic budget deficit that had Sarah Vance summoning him to the glass-walled execution chamber. It was a simple, terrifying metric glowing on the screen of his cracked smartphone, 102.4, the rising temperature of his toddler. Outside the boardroom, the humming floor of next-gen logistics was a symphony of clicking keyboards and ringing phones, a machine Elias had built from the ground up. He had spent the last 48 hours jacked into the mainframe on nothing but cold espresso and sheer willpower, patching the global routing algorithm. The code he was writing held together $400 million in global freight, a delicate web of supply chains spanning across 3 continents. But right now, the only supply chain Elias cared about was getting children's ibuprofen into the bloodstream of a 3-year-old boy named Leo. Elias stood on the plush carpet, shifting his weight, his eyes darting from Sarah's perfectly manicured hands to the vibrating phone burning a hole in his pocket. Sarah Vance, the chief executive officer, did not look up from her tablet, her silver pen tapping a sharp, impatient rhythm against the leather folio on the mahogany table. She wore an immaculate white suit that looked like armor, her posture rigid, radiating the kind of absolute authority that did not just demand respect, it extracted it. The silver pen stopped tapping, hovering over the screen as she finally swiped past a spreadsheet and let the silence stretch out, thick and suffocating. "And you," she continued, her gaze remaining fixed on the glowing pixels, "are trying to run it with a toddler strapped to your back." Elias felt a spike of adrenaline pierce his deep exhaustion, his jaw tightening as the insult landed, precise and calculated to make him feel incredibly small. He thought about the daycare nurse's panicked voicemail, the way she described Leo shivering in the isolation cot. "I have hit every key performance indicator we set for the quarter." "Sarah?" Elias said, fighting to keep the tremor of desperation out of his chest. He leaned forward, placing his hands on the cold mahogany, trying to bridge the vast, invisible canyon that separated her corporate world from his desperate reality. "The new firewall patch is 90% compiled, and the routing efficiency is up 12%, so I just need to leave 90 minutes early today." Continuous vibration that signaled the daycare was escalating their calls, threatening to take Leo to the emergency room themselves. "I will be back online by 6, Elias promised, his voice rushing now, stumbling over the words as panic began to heavily cloud his judgment. Sarah slowly set her tablet down, the soft click echoing in the cavernous room like a judge's wooden gavel finalizing a grim, predetermined sentence. She steepled her fingers, her pale blue eyes finally locking onto his, and Elias felt the temperature in the room plummet as he met a gaze like dry ice. "NextGen is entering a critical funding round, Elias." She stood up, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling. "I need all-in players on the field right now, and I cannot build a unicorn company with part-time parents who drop the ball the second a daycare sneezes." The cruelty of the phrase struck Elias like a physical blow, invalidating the terrifying vulnerability of raising a child entirely alone in a city with absolutely no safety net. His wife had passed away when Leo was only 6 months old, a fact Sarah knew intimately, a fact she had once called unfortunate but completely irrelevant to business. Elias swallowed the rising bile in his throat, his mind violently flashing to the half-empty canister of formula in his kitchen and the stack of past-due medical bills. "I am all in," Elias said, his voice dropping to a fierce, quiet whisper that echoed strangely against the thick glass walls surrounding them. Sarah turned around, her expression utterly unchanged, untouched by his anger, untouched by his fear, operating on a frequency of pure, unadulterated, and ruthless capitalism. "You were the system," she corrected him smoothly, walking back to her leather chair and pressing a small silver intercom button on the polished console. "You have lost your competitive edge, Elias. Your priorities are deeply divided, and in this industry, divided attention is a massive liability I simply cannot afford to subsidize." Severing his livelihood, his security, and his future in a single stroke. Elias felt the blood violently drain from his face, a cold, "You are firing me," he stated, the words tasting bitter and metallic in his mouth, his brilliant brain struggling to process the sheer, catastrophic absurdity of the timing. He was in the middle of a critical kernel update, a massive encryption overhaul that only he understood, a complex digital lockbox holding the company's precious lifeblood. "We are restructuring the engineering department to better align with our aggressive growth targets," she recited, slipping effortlessly into the sterile, bloodless language of corporate human resources. "Security will be up in exactly 3 minutes to see you out of the building, and your severance package is standard for an employee of your specific tenure." She picked up her tablet again, her thumb hovering over the screen, ready to swipe him away into the digital trash bin of her meticulously organized memory. "Do not make this harder than it has to be, Elias. Just leave your keycard on the desk, and you will receive an email regarding your health insurance options." Health insurance, the words echoed painfully in Elias's mind, amplifying the panic surrounding Leo's raging fever, the impending doctor's visit, and the expensive co-pays he could no longer afford. He desperately wanted to scream at her, to flip the heavy mahogany table, to furiously explain that without his encryption handshake, the entire routing algorithm would instantly self-cannibalize. He opened his mouth, the dire warnings forming rapidly on his tongue, the complex technical jargon ready to explain exactly how badly she was crippling her own massive company. But then his phone buzzed for the 4th time, a frantic, vibrating, an undeniable heartbeat against his thigh, and all the residual fight abruptly drained out of his exhausted bones. The company was not his sick child, the complex algorithm was not his flesh and blood, and NextGen Logistics could burn to the ground, but Leo was currently waiting. Elias closed his mouth, swallowing the technical warnings, swallowing his professional pride, and gave Sarah Vance a single, curt nod that signaled the absolute, irreversible end of their partnership. He turned on his heel and walked rapidly toward the heavy glass door, his sneakers completely silent against the carpet, his mind already calculating the quickest route to his car. He did not look back as he forcefully pushed through the door, leaving the freezing, sterile atmosphere of the boardroom and stepping back into the chaotic, loud engineering floor. The sudden noise was incredibly jarring, a loud cacophony of ringing phones and shouted commands, totally oblivious to the fact that their master architect had just been summarily executed. He walked quickly down the central aisle, his tired eyes fixed firmly on his cluttered cubicle at the far end, completely ignoring the questioning glances of the junior developers. A security guard in a dark blue blazer was already waiting patiently by his desk, thick arms crossed, face set in a rigid mask of practiced, professional detachment. Elias grabbed a single, empty cardboard box from the blue recycling bin by the network printer, his rigid movements highly mechanical, his brain now operating on pure survival instinct. He did not have very much to pack, even though he had practically lived at this desk, because the physical artifacts of his actual life were surprisingly sparse. A framed photograph of Leo at the local park, laughing amidst a giant pile of colorful autumn leaves, went into the box first, carefully wrapped in a spare gray sweater. Next came his expensive ergonomic keyboard, a cherished gift from his late wife, the mechanical keys worn smooth by millions of lines of code written in the dead of night. He unplugged his heavy noise-canceling headphones, throwing them carelessly over the keyboard, followed quickly by a handful of proprietary notebooks filled entirely with his chaotic, brilliant, and unreadable scribbles. The burly security guard shifted his weight impatiently, tapping his two-way radio, projecting an aggressive aura of intimidation that Elias found completely unnecessary and deeply insulting given the dire circumstances. Elias reached deep into his front pocket, pulling out the heavy, metal-trimmed security keycard that formally granted him elite, unrestricted access to every single server room in the building. He placed it gently on the center of his remarkably empty desk, the thick plastic snapping sharply against the faux wood laminate, a definitive period at the end of a long sentence. He picked up the cardboard box, the sheer weight of it surprisingly heavy, filled entirely with the sad remnants of his extreme dedication, his sleepless nights, and his misplaced loyalty. As he slowly turned to leave, his large monitor suddenly flickered, a black command prompt box popping up directly over his software interface, blinking rapidly with a series of errors. The massive kernel update and the complex firewall patch were currently sitting in digital limbo, waiting patiently for the final, manual encryption handshake that only his biometric login could authenticate. Elias hesitated for a tiny fraction of a second, his tired eyes locked onto the blinking cursor, knowing exactly what would tragically happen when the automated server reboot triggered shortly. The guard loudly cleared his throat, stepping deliberately into Elias's direct line of sight, gesturing toward the main elevator banks with a stiff, unyielding, and highly impatient wave of his hand. The difficult choice was instantly made, so Elias firmly adjusted his tight grip on the box, turned his back entirely on the blinking cursor, and let the guard loudly escort him away. He walked past the huge glass walls of the main server room, watching the endless racks of blinking green lights, a soothing, familiar rhythm that was about to turn violently red. Stepping slowly into the empty elevator, he blindly pressed the glowing button for the underground parking garage, the metal doors sliding shut and cutting off the hum of the office. The rapid descent was totally silent, the horrible sinking feeling in his tight stomach perfectly mirroring the fast drop of the elevator, his mind running terrifying, desperate financial calculations. The elevator softly chimed at the damp garage level, and as Elias stepped out into the echoing concrete structure, he finally answered his ringing phone, completely unaware of the looming disaster above. 12 minutes after the heavy glass doors of the lobby closed behind Elias Thorne, the digital heartbeat of next-gen logistics began to flutter, high above the damp parking garage. On the deeply chilled fourth floor of the glass skyscraper, the Global Command Center operated in a state of hushed, reverent focus. This was the undisputed brain of the beast, a massive circular room dominated by a curved, floor-to-ceiling holographic projection known affectionately by the entire engineering staff as the Pulse. The Pulse was a breathtaking visualization of modern commerce, tracking the continuous, complex movement of shipping containers, long-haul trucks, and heavy freight trains across 3 sprawling continents. Millions of tiny green lines arched gracefully across the glowing digital map, representing billions of dollars of raw materials, consumer electronics, and highly perishable pharmaceuticals in constant, synchronized motion. David Chun, the deeply analytical chief technology officer, stood proudly on the elevated central platform holding a lukewarm cup of chamomile tea, admiring the flawless flow of the morning logistics. David was a quiet man who genuinely preferred machines to human beings, finding a deep, comforting poetry in the predictability of well-written code and the steady hum of perfectly cooled servers. He knew perfectly well that Elias was currently working on a critical kernel update, a massive integration of a completely new firewall protocol designed specifically to repel aggressive state-sponsored cyber attacks. What David did not know, and could not possibly have anticipated, was that the brilliant architect of that magnificent digital fortress had just been unceremoniously escorted from the premises holding a cardboard box. At exactly 15 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, the automated cron job that Elias had carefully scheduled to finalize the massive update initiated its sequence, blindly executing its program duty without human oversight. The central server reached out across the vast internal network with digital tendrils, eagerly searching for the final cryptographic handshake, the unique biometric security key that lived exclusively on Elias's secure workstation. The master server pinged the workstation, expecting a rapid, seamless validation to lock the new firewall firmly into place and secure the vulnerable perimeter of the global routing algorithm. Instead, the server hit a massive, unexpected dead end, bouncing violently off an aggressively suspended user account and a deactivated security credential that no longer possessed any internal privileges whatsoever. The absolute lack of a familiar response triggered a deeply buried, highly sensitive security failsafe that Elias had specifically designed to protect the intricate system from unauthorized internal hijacking. The advanced algorithm instantly assumed the massive silence was a hostile, coordinated takeover attempt, a malicious ghost in the machine actively trying to rewrite the central command architecture without any hesitation or warning sirens. The defensive protocols slammed down like heavy iron portcullises in a besieged medieval castle. Brutally severing all external connections to the routing mainframe, David lowered his ceramic cup of tea slowly as the very first subtle anomaly appeared on the massive holographic map dominating the front wall of the otherwise quiet command center. A massive cluster of heavy cargo ships currently navigating the crowded, dangerous waters of the Suez Canal suddenly stopped updating their geospatial coordinates, their tiny green digital icons freezing completely in place. Before David could even formulate a rational question, a sharp, collective gasp echoed loudly across the room from the dozen senior engineers sitting at their curved, monitor-laden workstations. The frozen icons floating in the Mediterranean abruptly turned a sickly shade of yellow, indicating a severe loss of telemetry, before violently flashing crimson red to signify a total communication blackout. The crimson infection spread with a terrifying, unstoppable speed, racing across the digital representation of the Atlantic Ocean as a fleet of automated cargo planes abruptly lost their dynamically optimized flight path data. In less than 30 seconds, the entire eastern seaboard of the United States lit up like a horrific digital wildfire, representing tens of thousands of transport trucks suddenly driving completely blind without dispatch. David dropped his tea, the ceramic mug shattering loudly against the raised metal grating of the platform, the hot liquid splattering entirely unnoticed across his expensive, polished leather shoes. Run a manual diagnostic on the central routing server immediately, David shouted, his voice cracking with a sudden, overwhelming panic that completely shattered the previously calm, academic atmosphere of the room. We cannot access the administrative terminal, a senior developer yelled back, her fingers flying desperately across her illuminated, mechanical keyboard as she frantically tried every single backdoor bypass she knew. The system is aggressively rejecting my credentials, she added, her voice rising an entire octave as a cascading, unstoppable wall of red error messages completely overran her primary widescreen monitor. David practically leapt down the metal stairs, rushing to her terminal and violently shoving her rolling chair aside to physically pound his own executive master override codes into the locked console. Access permanently denied. The screen simply blinked back at him in bold, unapologetic white letters, a stark and terrifying condemnation of his absolute powerlessness within his own technological domain. The entire command center instantly erupted into pure, unadulterated chaos, a deafening cacophony of ringing proximity alarms, shouting voices, and the frantic, useless clicking of keyboards as everyone fought a rapidly losing battle. Every single tracking node on the pulse was now a violent, pulsing red, indicating that exactly $400 million worth of active global freight was completely paralyzed, unguided, and exposed. Autonomous trucks in Nevada were missing their narrow delivery windows. Highly automated warehouses in Germany were halting their massive sorting lines, and refrigerated containers of vital medicine were slowly losing their temperature-controlled power feeds. Far away from the noise, back in her pristine, perfectly silent corner office, Sarah Vance was calmly reviewing a highly optimistic quarterly revenue projection for the board of directors. She remained completely unaware of the massive digital apocalypse unfolding rapidly just down the hall, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction about her decisive, ruthless action regarding Elias. She firmly believed that ruthlessly trimming the fat and demanding absolute, undivided loyalty was essential for building a lean, aggressive startup capable of dominating the fiercely competitive logistics sector. Her quiet, self-congratulatory reverie was abruptly shattered when her heavy oak office door was thrown violently open, rebounding harshly against the wall with a loud, cracking thud that made her physically jump out of her chair. David stood frozen in the doorway, his silk tie askew, his face completely drained of all healthy color, looking exactly like a man who had just personally witnessed the tragic, unstoppable end of the world. The primary routing algorithm has completely collapsed, David gasped out, struggling violently to catch his breath after sprinting up 2 entire flights of concrete stairs when the biometric elevators suddenly locked down. Sarah stood up instantly, Her perfect practiced posture completely rigid with sudden tension. Her analytical mind utterly rejecting the catastrophic information he was attempting to deliver to her. That is statistically impossible, she snapped coldly, walking quickly around her massive desk and grabbing her desk phone to call the emergency technical support team directly to handle whatever minor glitch this was. It is absolutely not a glitch, Sarah. It is a catastrophic cascading failure directly caused by a severe encryption handshake during the highly critical firewall update, David explained, his hands shaking visibly at his sides. He aggressively grabbed the phone directly out from her hand and slammed it forcefully back onto the receiver, a deeply insubordinate action that clearly illustrated the absolute, unprecedented desperation of the unfolding crisis. The system firmly believes we are under a massive cyber attack, so it has completely locked us out, revoked all administrative privileges globally, and is currently heavily quarantining the entire active routing database. Sarah stared at him, a cold, heavy dread slowly creeping up her spine, entirely replacing the warm, triumphant glow of her previous executive victory with a chilling, nauseating sense of impending doom. Then simply bypass the quarantine protocols and manually reboot the physical server on the floor, she ordered, her voice trembling slightly, but desperately fighting to retain its commanding, authoritative executive edge. We literally cannot do that, David practically screamed, running a trembling, sweaty hand through his thinning hair, his eyes wide with a pure, feral terror that Sarah had never seen in him before. The only person on this entire planet who currently possesses the dynamic encryption key to validate the update and successfully unlock the system is the chief architect who literally just designed the entirely new architecture from scratch. Where is Elias right now? David demanded, looking wildly around the empty, vast executive suite as if the exhausted, underappreciated single father might suddenly materialize from behind a potted fern to miraculously save them. The cold dread currently pooling in Sarah's stomach instantly solidified into a heavy, immovable block of pure ice as the catastrophic, astronomical magnitude of her recent executive decision finally hit her. I fired him just 10 minutes ago, she whispered, the two incredibly destructive words sounding pathetic and small in the vast, quiet expanse of her incredibly luxurious, sparsely decorated office. You did what to him? David whispered back, staggering backward a single heavy step, as if she had just physically struck him violently across the face with a heavy, blunt instrument. He was totally distracted. He stubbornly wanted to leave early because his child had a slight fever, and I absolutely cannot tolerate part-time commitment during a highly critical venture capital funding phase, she defended herself. Her voice sounding incredibly weak, David let out a harsh, broken sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob, turning his deeply tired gaze toward the massive window overlooking the bustling city below. Finally realizing the absolute absurdity of the situation. You literally fired the only person securely holding the digital keys to a $400 million empire simply because of a small toddler's afternoon fever, he summarized, his tone dripping with sheer, unfiltered disbelief. The intercom sitting on Sarah's desk suddenly buzzed loudly, the harsh electronic sound slicing painfully through the suffocating, heavy tension in the room like a jagged, heavily rusted knife. Miss Vance, her terrified assistant's voice echoed through the small speaker. The executives from the major global shipping conglomerates are all calling simultaneously, angrily demanding to know why their entire logistical chains have gone completely blind. Exactly how much capital are we actively losing right now? Sarah asked, turning slowly back to David, her deeply ingrained business instincts desperately trying to quantify the exact monetary value of this unprecedented disaster. David closed his eyes tightly, quickly performing the grim, devastating mental arithmetic based on their strict contractual penalty clauses, mandatory idle time compensation, and guaranteed delivery window defaults, based strictly on the sheer volume of global freight currently paralyzed and our incredibly strict service level agreements. We are actively bleeding approximately $140,000. Every single 60 seconds. Sarah felt the blood rush completely out of her head, leaving her dangerously dizzy and nauseous. As she stared blankly at the ticking silver clock sitting elegantly on the corner of her vast mahogany desk, every single minute that slowly ticked by without a firm resolution was aggressively draining another massive fortune from their limited operational capital, burning rapidly through their recent investor funding faster than a literal bonfire. In less than 10 minutes, they would effortlessly lose well over $1 million, and in barely an hour, the entire company would be completely insolvent, totally bankrupt, and facing a massive mountain of aggressive litigation. We have a dedicated, highly paid disaster recovery team specifically for this reason, Sarah insisted, desperately grasping at invisible straws, trying frantically to find a standardized corporate solution to a profoundly technical nightmare she had personally created. Get them on the secure line right now. Tell them to explicitly authorize a massive brute force decryption on the main server. Simply do whatever it currently takes to forcefully break through that new firewall. They are literally already trying to do exactly that, David replied, his voice completely hollow and utterly devoid of any lingering hope as he slumped heavily against the expensive leather sofa against the far wall. But Elias specifically designed this incredible encryption protocol to withstand a massive, coordinated digital attack from a hostile nation-state, so our internal team trying to brute force. It is exactly like throwing small pebbles at a massive titanium bank vault. Down on the 4th floor in the command center, the dire situation was rapidly deteriorating from a state of controlled panic into one of absolute, unmitigated despair as the helpless engineers watched the massive red map glow menacingly. The highly skilled lead developer, a young woman named Maya, who had trained for years directly under Elias, was frantically typing complex lines of override code into a secondary terminal, hot tears of frustration streaming quickly down her face. The primary server was actively and aggressively fighting back against her. Recognizing her unauthorized attempts to bypass the heavy lock and systematically shutting down her secondary access points one by one. It is currently executing a deeply aggressive defensive compartmentalization protocol, Maya shouted out to the entire room, her voice echoing loudly over the ringing alarms just as her primary screen suddenly went completely and permanently black. If we keep trying to violently force our way inside the mainframe, the system is going heavily panic and automatically wipe the entire active memory bank to permanently protect the proprietary source code from what it firmly perceives as aggressive corporate theft. If that catastrophic wipe actually happens, they would permanently lose every single piece of dynamic routing data from the last 48 hours, instantly turning a very temporary, expensive outage into an absolutely unrecoverable permanent and company-ending disaster. Stop all brute force network attempts immediately, David ordered forcefully through the public address system, his desperate voice echoing loudly from the heavy speakers mounted high in the ceiling of the command center. He stood closely next to Sarah's desk, holding the public address microphone with a highly visible, trembling hand, looking directly at the powerful chief executive officer with a cold gaze that held absolutely no respect or deference anymore. Everyone down there needs to physically step entirely away from your keyboards right now. Absolutely do not touch anything else. Do not attempt to systematically log in. Just let the hostile system safely idle in its current defensive posture. The massive command center instantly fell into a terrifying, paralyzed silence. Dozens of highly trained, incredibly expensive engineers sitting completely helpless in front of their deeply locked screens, just silently watching the red lights aggressively blink. The only sound left in the massive, high-tech room was the low, steady, rhythmic hum of the massive industrial cooling units desperately keeping the deeply inaccessible, overworked servers from violently overheating and catching fire. Upstairs, Sarah began to pace frantically back and forth directly behind her desk, her expensive designer heels sinking deeply into the plush white carpet, her sharp mind racing desperately through a massive, terrifying list of incredibly terrible options. Could we somehow possibly rebuild the global routing paths entirely manually? She asked loosely, knowing exactly how completely ridiculous and desperate the question sounded even as the words quickly left her perfectly glossed lips. David simply stared blankly at her. Utterly exhausted by her profound, deeply dangerous lack of fundamental understanding regarding the massive, complex digital machine she confidently claimed to effectively manage. We are currently tracking well over 200,000 individual cargo shipments globally. Sarah, dynamically accounting for shifting weather patterns, heavy traffic density, unexpected port delays, and optimal fuel efficiency in absolute real dash time. It would easily take a dedicated team of 1,000 brilliant human mathematicians, roughly 6 entirely uninterrupted months, to manually calculate the exact routing efficiency that the algorithm effortlessly handles in a tiny fraction of a single millisecond. The heavy silver clock on the desk softly clicked forward yet another minute, loudly signaling the silent, completely tragic evaporation of another $140,000 into the digital abyss. Sarah abruptly stopped pacing, catching her own pale reflection in the massive floor-to-ceiling window, clearly seeing a deeply terrified woman whose immaculate, previously impenetrable confident armor was rapidly cracking into 1,000 tiny, jagged, irreparable pieces. She had proudly built her entire professional reputation on fiercely being the smartest, most ruthlessly pragmatic person in every single room, the bold visionary leader who proudly made the incredibly hard choices to fiercely ensure maximum uncompromised profitability. But the massive, completely glaring blind spot in her ruthlessly efficient corporate philosophy was currently staring right back at her, heavily exposing the incredibly fragile, deeply human foundation her entire digital empire was actually built upon. She had completely and foolishly forgotten that the brilliant, tireless machines currently powering her vast, unprecedented wealth were meticulously created and deeply maintained by actual, living people with messy, deeply complicated, and highly demanding personal lives, people who deeply loved their children, and sometimes simply needed to leave work early to care for a sick toddler, people whose genuine loyalty could not be simply commanded by a large paycheck, but fundamentally had to be earned through basic, foundational human decency. Yet another minute slowly passed on the heavy clock. Yet another massive fortune vanished completely into the ether, and the furious, non-stop ringing of the numerous phones from the outer office began to deeply sound exactly like a slow, somber funeral dirge. The primary venture capital investors are absolutely going to violently pull their term sheets the exact second they find out about this catastrophic, embarrassing vulnerability, Sarah whispered, finally acknowledging the absolute, undeniable reality of their swiftly impending doom. They are definitely not just going to pull the funding term sheets. They are absolutely going to furiously sue us completely into oblivion for gross, unmitigated negligence and a total, unforgivable breach of our fundamental fiduciary responsibility. David corrected her deeply and grimly. He slowly pushed himself heavily off the expensive leather sofa, mechanically adjusting his wildly askew tie, his overall posture shifting completely from frantic panic to a quiet, deeply terrifying resignation, as he quietly prepared for the inevitable, massive corporate collapse. We literally have exactly one single viable option left on the table, Sarah, and it absolutely does not gracefully involve any more clever corporate posturing, useless human resources jargon, or aggressive, dominant management tactics. You are going to immediately walk directly out of this beautiful office, take the main elevator slowly down to the cold lobby, and fiercely pray to whatever higher deity you possibly believe in that Elias Thorne has not successfully driven out of the underground parking garage yet. Sarah hesitated slightly, her massive, heavily ingrained corporate pride staging one final, desperate, completely useless rebellion against the deeply, profoundly humiliating prospect of physically crawling right back to the very man she had just ruthlessly and coldly discarded like trash. Can we not just simply call his mobile device and offer him a massive financial bonus to fix this remotely? She asked, gesturing vaguely toward the desk phone, desperately hoping to somehow handle the massive surrender from the safe, highly sterile distance of a telecommunication line. You personally ordered security to completely revoke his corporate phone plan exactly 20 minutes ago. David reminded her sharply, his voice now perfectly flat and entirely devoid of emotion. violently stripping away the absolutely last remaining shred of her executive authority. His highly secure keycard is permanently deactivated. His entire corporate email history is wiped. His internal network access is completely burned to the ground. And as far as the next-gen logistics system is actively concerned, Elias Thorne simply no longer exists, but unfortunately for us, without his specific existence, we absolutely do not exist either, David finalized heavily. Turning his back entirely on her and walking slowly toward the heavy door, leaving her entirely alone with the completely disastrous, ruinous consequences of her own terrible actions. Sarah looked silently at the softly ticking silver clock. One last agonizing time, watching yet another highly expensive minute pass away, watching another massive chunk of her company disappearing permanently simply because she aggressively refused to accommodate a very basic, simple human need. She violently grabbed her personal mobile phone, quickly bypassed her deeply terrified assistant in the outer office, and practically ran in a dead sprint toward the heavy glass doors leading to the main hallway, her heart hammering painfully against her ribs with the incredible force of a deeply terrified, frantically trapped bird. The exceptionally long walk completely down the empty hallway toward the main executive elevator suddenly felt exactly like a grim march straight to a waiting guillotine. Every single heavy step echoing loudly in the suddenly quiet, intensely paranoid halls of the usually bustling executive floor. She violently slammed her open palm heavily against the glowing circular down button, frantically praying for the slow, highly mechanical metal box to somehow arrive much faster, completely realizing that the entire fate of $400 million now rested entirely on whether a dedicated, exhausted single father was slowly taking his sweet time carefully, buckling his highly feverish toddler into a secure car seat. Elias pushed the heavy metal door leading from the elevator vestibule into the vast, dimly lit expanse of the underground parking garage, the stagnant air smelling faintly of old motor oil and damp concrete. The cardboard box in his arms felt significantly lighter now that he had finally crossed the official threshold of next-gen logistics. Severing his physical ties to the crushing, demanding machine operating high above him, he walked deliberately down the long row of parked, expensive luxury vehicles, his tired eyes scanning for his own sensible, slightly battered silver sedan. Parked far in the deeply shadowed back corner of the structure, every single step away from the building felt incredibly surreal, a bizarre mixture of profound relief and absolutely terrifying, paralyzing anxiety about how he was going to afford rent next month. He finally reached his car, placing the cardboard box of his meager professional belongings heavily onto the cold, dusty trunk before pulling his keys from his pocket to unlock the rear passenger door. In the back seat, safely strapped into his heavily padded car seat, little Leo was shifting restlessly, his small face flushed a deep, unhealthy shade of crimson that immediately made Elias's chest tighten with deep, parental panic. Elias leaned entirely into the back seat, resting his cool palm gently against his son's burning forehead, feeling the unnatural, radiating heat that instantly validated every single professional sacrifice he had just forcefully made upstairs. Hey buddy, Daddy is finally here, Elias whispered softly, his voice trembling slightly as he quickly unzipped his own jacket to drape it carefully over the shivering toddler's small, fragile shoulders. He reached blindly into the chaotic diaper bag sitting on the floorboard, his fingers frantically searching for the digital thermometer and the small, plastic bottle of bright pink children's ibuprofen. The absolute deafening silence of the underground garage was a stark, almost beautiful contrast to the chaotic, ringing nightmare of the engineering floor he had just been ruthlessly banished from. But that peaceful, momentary silence was abruptly and violently shattered by the explosive, echoing sound of the heavy emergency fire doors bursting completely open. At the far end of the concrete structure, Elias did not bother to look up from his son, carefully measuring out the exact dosage of liquid medicine into the tiny plastic cup, completely focused entirely on the only metric in the world that actually mattered to him right now, the frantic, unmistakable sound of expensive designer heels clicking rapidly and desperately against the hard concrete, began to echo loudly through the cavernous space, the rhythm entirely chaotic and completely devoid of its usual, terrifying executive precision. "Elias, wait," the sharp voice desperately called out, the sound bouncing wildly off the concrete pillars, completely stripping away the usual icy acoustic dampening of the luxurious executive boardroom. Sarah Vance was literally sprinting across the underground parking garage, her immaculate white suit jacket flying open, her perfect posture entirely destroyed by pure, unadulterated panic as she dodged dangerously between parked cars. She was completely out of breath by the time she finally reached the back of his silver sedan. Heavily grabbing the edge of his trunk to physically steady herself, her chest heaving violently as she stared at his turned back, Elias meticulously held the tiny plastic cup to Leo's lips, softly encouraging the sick toddler to swallow the bitter medicine, completely and utterly ignoring the immensely powerful billionaire chief executive currently gasping for air exactly 3 feet behind him. "The entire system is completely down," Sarah gasped out, her voice cracking painfully as she desperately tried to project her usual commanding authority while simultaneously begging for her absolute corporate survival. "We absolutely need the final encryption handshake code for the massive firewall update right now," she demanded, the desperate words tumbling over each other. In a chaotic, terrified rush that sounded nothing like her usual, calculated delivery. Elias slowly pulled his head out of the back seat, gently closing the heavy car door to shield his sleeping son from the harsh, echoing noise of her rising panic. Before turning around to finally face her, he leaned casually against the cold metal of his car, crossing his arms over his chest. His face a perfectly blank, unreadable mask that completely mirrored the exact coldness she had shown him just 20 minutes earlier. "I am incredibly sorry to hear about your technical difficulties, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice perfectly smooth and utterly devoid of any professional sympathy or lingering corporate loyalty. "However, as you explicitly pointed out to me in the boardroom, I am no longer an all-in player on your field. So I highly suggest you immediately contact your dedicated, highly paid disaster recovery team. They are entirely locked out. Elias, the system absolutely believes we are currently under a massive, coordinated cyber attack and has brutally severed all external connections," she confessed, her proud face turning a pale, sickly shade of gray in the dim garage lighting. "We are currently bleeding exactly $140,000 every single 60 seconds that the global routing algorithm remains completely offline and completely quarantined." Elias felt a tiny, unexpected spark of dark, vengeful satisfaction flare briefly in his chest. A deep, primal vindication that his brilliant, complex code was successfully protecting itself exactly as he had meticulously designed it to do. That sounds exactly like a highly critical metric for a massive venture capital funding round, Elias noted dryly, slowly reaching into his pocket to retrieve his heavily cracked smartphone to check the exact time for the pediatrician appointment. "I will literally triple your previous engineering salary right here, right this very second," she pleaded desperately, taking a sudden step forward and closing the physical distance between them as, if sheer proximity could violently force him into compliance, "I will instantly authorize a massive, 6-figure cash bonus directly into your personal checking account before you even open your laptop. Just please, I am begging you to manually fix this catastrophic nightmare." $2 million of absolutely vital operational capital had already evaporated into thin air while she was frantically running down the stairs, a devastating reality that was currently crushing her entire chest like a physical vice. Elias looked deeply into her pale, terrified blue eyes, clearly seeing the total collapse of her carefully constructed corporate armor, realizing with profound clarity that she genuinely believed money could simply buy her way out of any human consequence. "It is absolutely not about the money, Sarah, and it fundamentally never was about the money for me," Elias said softly, the quiet, undeniable truth of his statement ringing loudly in the damp, echoing space between them. "You ruthlessly fired me because I had a deeply personal priority that temporarily ranked much higher than your immediate, unyielding profit margin, entirely disregarding my years of dedicated, Sleepless loyalty over a single 90-minute absence. You boldly told me you absolutely could not build a unicorn company with a part-time parent, heavily implying that my sick child was nothing more than a highly inconvenient, disposable liability to your grand, sweeping vision. Sarah swallowed hard, visibly flinching as her own cruel, calculated words were thrown precisely and heavily back into her face, the immense gravity of her catastrophic lack of empathy finally crushing her completely. Elias slowly uncrossed his arms, his posture shifting from defensive to something entirely new, a quiet, immovable strength that radiated from the absolute certainty of his current, unprecedented leverage. If I actually agree to open my laptop and reach back into that massive digital fortress to save your entirely burning empire, I am absolutely not doing it as your subservient, easily disposable employee. I will only intervene as an entirely independent, highly specialized external consultant. And you need to thoroughly understand right now that my specific terms of engagement have drastically and permanently changed. I absolutely agree to whatever you want. She surrendered instantly, her voice dropping to a desperate, breathless whisper, as she frantically checked the heavy silver watch on her wrist, physically watching another $100,000 burn away. Just name your exact price, name your exact title, name your absolute conditions. I literally do not care anymore. Just please stop the incredible bleeding before my entire company completely ceases to exist. Elias did not smile triumphantly, nor did he gloat over her complete, devastating humiliation, because his brilliant mind was already moving rapidly past the petty vengeance and strictly focusing on fundamentally rewriting the totally broken system that had actively created this nightmare. He slowly turned back toward his car, reaching carefully over the cardboard box to retrieve the heavy, black titanium laptop bag that he had intentionally not packed inside with the rest of his disposable desk items. He knew absolutely well that he held the entire beating heart of next-gen logistics inside that bag, and as he unzipped it under the flickering fluorescent lights of the garage, the absolute balance of power shifted permanently and irreversibly.